Imagine sitting in first class with a valid ticket in your hand, yet being told over and over again that you don't belong. Imagine the eyes of strangers on you, the whispers, the humiliation. Now imagine staying perfectly calm, refusing to move, while an entire airline system begins to bend around your quiet strength. What happens when dignity meets power? What happens when one man's silence speaks louder than the voices trying to erase him? And what if the person they tried to push out of seat 2A was not just another passenger, but the very man who built the system that keeps the airline alive? This is not just a story about a seat on a plane. It is about respect, about justice, and about how 25 minutes of truth can bring an entire corporation to its knees. Will calm resolve be enough to expose the truth? Will the airline survive the storm it tried to ignore? And most importantly, what would you do if it happened to you? Stay with us, because this is one flight you'll never forget. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Let's take off together into the story. The sliding glass doors parted as Dr. Xavier Cole stepped into the departures hall of Baltimore Washington International. A wave of air, chilled by industrial vents, brushed across his face. Outside, summer humidity clung to the sidewalks like an extra layer of clothing, but inside, the air smelled faintly of roasted coffee and floor polish. It was 6:45 in the evening, and the terminal pulsed with its usual mixture of routine and chaos. Families huddled around suitcases, business travelers hunched over laptops, mouths moving silently as they rehearsed presentations. Announcements echoed overhead, each voice competing against the metallic clatter of rolling luggage. Xavier paused just inside the doorway, letting the rhythm of the airport wash over him. He had always believed that airports were modern cathedrals, built not of stone and stained glass, but of schedules, screens, and the promise of destinations. They held a kind of collective heartbeat. Thousands of strangers gathered for one shared act moving. For most people, airports were a way station. For him, they were also stages where society revealed itself without filters. Who was trusted, who was doubted, who was welcomed, and who was quietly asked to prove they belonged. He adjusted the strap of his leather briefcase. It was scuffed at the corners, though he could easily afford another. He kept it for sentimental reasons. It had been a gift from his wife years ago, back when the company was just him, a rented office, and 3 engineers who believed in his vision. Now, Cole Dynamics had grown into one of the most critical infrastructure firms in North America, quietly running systems that kept airlines, banks, and even hospitals moving. Most passengers in this terminal had no idea they were walking beneath screens powered by his company's code. He preferred it that way. His boarding pass rested in his breast pocket. First class, seat 2A, destination San Francisco. On paper, it was just another trip, a 5-hour hop across the country. In reality, it carried weight. Tomorrow, he was set to finalize negotiations for a new aviation tech hub in Silicon Valley. The deal was worth billions. But as he walked toward the security line, his mind wasn't on contracts or numbers. It was on the conversation he'd had with his daughter the night before. "Daddy, do people ever look at you like you don't belong?" she had asked. She was 14, curious, unflinchingly direct. He had hesitated before answering, unsure how much of the world's sharpness she was ready to hold. Eventually, he said, "Yes, they do. And sometimes the only way forward is to show them, calmly and firmly, that you belong everywhere you stand." Her eyes had studied his face carefully, as if memorizing not just the words, but the weight beneath them. Those words returned to him now as he threaded through security. The agent barely glanced at his ID before waving him through. Smooth, efficient, routine. But Xavier knew from experience that routine had an uncanny ability to bend depending on who stood in front of the desk. At the gate, the overhead screen blinked Redwood Air Flight 372 boarding in 25 minutes. Passengers had already begun to cluster, a loose semicircle forming around the desk. Xavier took a seat near the window. Beyond the glass, the aircraft rested at the jet bridge, nose angled toward the horizon. Its metallic skin reflected streaks of pink from the setting sun. He watched as ground crew moved with synchronized urgency, loading baggage, fueling tanks, inspecting wings. He admired their discipline. In aviation, precision was survival. He built his company on the same principle. A voice broke his reverie. "Excuse me, sir, is anyone sitting here?" A young mother gestured to the seat beside him, balancing a toddler on her hip. He smiled, shaking his head. She settled down, letting the child tap rhythmically on her phone screen. Xavier glanced at the boy, who looked no older than 3, and thought of the way children navigate airports wide-eyed, unafraid, trusting that the adults will guide them safely. He envied that innocence. His phone buzzed. A message from his assistant reminder review presentation slides on the flight. Investor call at 9 a.m. PT. He typed a quick acknowledgement, then slipped the phone away. He planned to review the slides. Yes, but he also knew his thoughts would wander, as they often did at 35,000 feet. The cabin was one of the few places he felt suspended between worlds, detached from the noise of constant decisions. The boarding announcement crackled overhead. Redwood Air Flight 372 to San Francisco will begin boarding first-class passengers in a few moments. A ripple of movement spread across the waiting area. Briefcases snapped shut, headphones pulled from ears, families gathered their belongings. Xavier rose slowly, giving the mother beside him space to collect her toddler. He straightened his jacket. He carried himself without hurry, without the sharp elbows some travelers wielded as weapons. Patience, he believed, was a form of quiet strength. As he approached the gate, he noticed the subtle shift. The agent scanning passes Paula, according to her name tag, offered wide smiles to the couple ahead of him, both white, both dressed casually. "Enjoy your flight?" she chirped, handing back their stubs. But when Xavier presented his pass, her expression stiffened almost imperceptibly. She studied the barcode, then glanced at his face, then back at the screen. The pause stretched just long enough for the line behind him to shuffle uneasily. One moment," she said, tapping her keyboard. Her voice was polite, but there was an edge beneath it, like a violin string pulled too tight. Xavier felt a familiar knot in his chest, the same knot he had carried since his 20s, when he was once asked to prove that the credit card in his hand really belonged to him. He breathed slowly, centering himself. Behind him, a man in a navy blazer sighed loudly. "Some of us have connections," he muttered. Xavier didn't turn. He had learned long ago that not every comment deserved oxygen. Paula scanned the pass again, still frowning. "Just need to double-check something," she said. She reached for the phone beside her, lips tightening as she dialed. The line grew restless. Eyes darted toward Xavier, curious, speculative. He stood silently, shoulders square, gaze steady on the jet bridge beyond. His daughter's voice echoed in his mind. "Do people ever look at you like you don't belong?" He inhaled, exhaled, chose to wait. In that moment, the hum of the terminal seemed to quiet, as if the airport itself was holding its breath. Something was shifting, though no one yet understood how far it would go. The line behind him shifted impatiently as Paula Whitman, the gate agent, kept her eyes fixed on the screen. She tapped another key, the corners of her mouth tightening. Xavier Cole stood silently, posture steady, waiting. He had been in boardrooms with senators and billionaires who tried every trick to rattle his calm. A delay at a gate was nothing compared to that. Still, the sting was there, quiet but sharp. He could feel it in the back of his throat, a tightening that came not from fear but from recognition. He had been here before. "Is there a problem?" he asked finally, his voice low and even. Paula looked up. "Just verifying something," she said, words clipped, eyes darting from his face to the boarding pass. "Please hold for a moment." A woman 2 spots behind leaned toward her husband. "Strange. They didn't check us like that last week," she whispered, not quite softly enough. The husband gave a small shrug, eyes fixed on the glowing phone in his hand. Xavier didn't react. His gaze drifted past Paula to the aircraft itself, gleaming under the halogen lights of the jet bridge. The plane was ready. Passengers were ready. He was ready. But something about him had triggered this pause, this moment of scrutiny. He could almost hear his daughter's voice again. "Daddy, do people ever look at you like you don't belong?" The question hovered like smoke around him. Finally. Paula spoke into the phone, nodding a few times before hanging up. She glanced at Xavier again, still frowning. "All right, go ahead," she said at last, waving him through, though her tone carried no warmth. The couple behind him barely waited before stepping up, their boarding passes scanned with a cheerful beep and a perfunctory smile. Xavier walked the jet bridge with measured steps, the echo of his shoes on the metal floor ringing louder in his ears than usual. Inside the aircraft, the air smelled of citrus cleaner and recycled oxygen. The hum of ventilation filled the narrow space. A flight attendant greeted him with a practiced smile. "Welcome aboard," she said, her eyes flicking briefly to the boarding pass still in his hand. For an instant, something unreadable crossed her expression: surprise, doubt, calculation, before she turned back to the next passenger. Xavier moved toward the front, slipping into first class. Row 2 was near the center of the cabin, just behind the bulkhead. Seat 2A by the window waited for him. He set his briefcase down, sliding into the wide leather chair. The seat was comfortable, plush enough to melt into, but he sat upright, adjusting the belt, folding his jacket neatly across his lap. He believed in composure, especially when others expected something else. The man in 2B, already seated, glanced over. Mid-40s, suit crisp, watch gleaming. Derek Lawson. The faint scent of cologne radiated from him, sharp and deliberate. Derek gave a polite nod, but his eyes lingered a second too long, as if searching for something incongruous, something out of place. "Evening," he said. "Evening," Xavier replied. He reached for the magazine in the seat pocket, though he wasn't interested in glossy pages about tropical resorts. He could feel the weight of Derek's sideways glance. The flow of passengers continued. Bags thumped into overhead bins. Voices rose and fell. A child laughed somewhere near the back, the sound high and unfiltered. The normal rhythms of boarding carried on, yet Xavier felt the subtle shift in air, the invisible tension that seemed to gather around him. He tried to let it pass. He tried to remind himself, you've built a company from scratch. You've testified before Congress. You've earned every mile and every seat. But dignity, he knew, wasn't about resumes. Dignity was supposed to be automatic. The need to constantly reassert it was the insult that never softened. He closed his eyes briefly. His father's face flickered in memory. Deep lines carved by years of factory shifts and quiet endurance. He remembered being 12 years old, riding a train to visit family in Virginia, watching a conductor point his father toward the colored car. His father had said nothing then, only taken his son's hand and guided him to the back, jaw tight, eyes forward. That silence had etched itself into Xavier's bones. He had sworn he would not carry it forward unchanged, not for himself, not for his daughter. The shuffle of footsteps broke his reverie. Paula, the gate agent, had stepped into the cabin, speaking with another crew member. Her gaze swept quickly across the seats before landing on him. She hesitated, then whispered something to her colleague. The colleague frowned, nodded, and disappeared toward the galley. Xavier kept his eyes on the window, where the tarmac glowed with painted lines and blinking lights. He had the uneasy sense that this was not over. Derek cleared his throat beside him. "Lot of extra checks these days," he remarked, tone casual but eyes sharp. "You know how it is. Security, fraud prevention. Can't be too careful." Xavier turned slowly. Their eyes met. Derek's expression hovered somewhere between forced friendliness and quiet accusation. Xavier offered a small, polite smile. "Of course," he said simply, his voice betraying none of the storm stirring inside. But inside, the storm was real. Should he confront it now? Should he ask directly why his presence in 2A was treated like an anomaly? Or should he let the process play out, knowing that silence could be mistaken for consent? He thought of his daughter again, of her question and the weight behind it. He thought of the millions of lines of code his teams had written, quietly running beneath the airline's very infrastructure. The irony was sharp, the system carrying this flight, the one scanning boarding passes, allocating seats, calculating routes his company had built it, and yet here he was, treated like an intruder in a seat he had paid for. A faint vibration buzzed through the armrest as his phone lit up. A notification from his assistant again, reminding him about tomorrow's investor call. He silenced it quickly. Right now, the bigger call was happening silently. Invisibly, a call between perception and reality, between the image others imposed and the truth of who he was. The cabin door closed with a solid thump. Overhead, bins latched shut. Passengers settled in. The captain's voice came over the intercom, warm and practiced. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard Redwood Air Flight 372 to San Francisco. We're expecting a smooth flight tonight, about 5 hours and 15 minutes en route. Please make yourselves comfortable as we prepare for departure." Comfort. The word landed like a challenge. Xavier adjusted in his seat, exhaled slowly, and let his hands rest on his knees. He could feel the eyes on him, not many, but enough. A quiet question hung in the recycled air. Did he belong here? He knew the answer. The real question was whether he would be forced to prove it. The engine hum beneath the cabin grew louder as the ground crew disconnected the jet bridge and secured the aircraft. Passengers buckled in, settling into their routines of magazines, headphones, and phone screens. For a moment it seemed as if the earlier tension at the gate might dissolve into the background of a typical cross-country flight. But the reprieve was brief. Paula reappeared from the galley, her expression set in the rigid professionalism of someone trying to disguise unease. She clutched a tablet, the glowing screen casting pale light on her face. Her eyes flicked quickly to 2A. Xavier sensed it before she even spoke. The knot in his chest tightened again, the same knot that had followed him through countless subtle encounters where suspicion was his shadow. "Mr. Cole," she asked, though her voice carried a faint doubt, as if she were not convinced the name matched the man before her. "Yes," he replied evenly. "I'm going to need to see your boarding pass again," she said, holding out her hand. Across the aisle, a man shifted in his seat, glancing up with curiosity. Derek Lawson in 2B straightened, a faint smirk touching his lips. He had been pretending to read the in-flight magazine, but his attention had never truly left the small drama unfolding inches away. The request felt unnecessary, almost theatrical, as though Paula was performing for an invisible audience that only she could see. Xavier reached calmly into his jacket pocket and produced the same boarding pass she had scanned at the gate. He handed it over, watching her eyes dart across the barcode and seat number. Her lips pressed together. She tapped the screen of her tablet, compared details, then exhaled sharply. "There seems to be a discrepancy," she said, more loudly this time, so that passengers nearby turned their heads. "I just need to confirm with my supervisor." Derek leaned back in his seat, muttering under his breath. "Never fails. There's always someone trying to slip into first class." The words weren't meant to be loud, but they were loud enough. Xavier heard them clearly, as did the woman in 3D across the aisle who shot Derek a sharp look. Xavier's jaw tightened, though his face remained calm. He had spent years cultivating the art of stillness under pressure. But stillness did not mean passivity. He was listening. He was remembering. He was calculating. Paula held on to his boarding pass longer than necessary before handing it back. "Please remain in your seat until my supervisor comes," she instructed. Her tone carried the authority of someone who believed protocol justified everything. Without waiting for a reply, she turned and walked briskly toward the galley. The murmurs began immediately. "What's going on?" whispered a man 2 rows back. "I thought we were about to push back." Another voice, female, answered, "I think there's an issue with someone's ticket." Words floated through the cabin like sparks in dry grass, small but capable of igniting larger fires. From seat 4C, a young woman pulled out her phone. Jade Nguyen was 21, a graduate student in sociology, traveling home to California after a conference. She had been scrolling through articles absent-mindedly when she noticed the exchange unfolding in first class. Something about the tension, the way the man in 2A held himself with quiet dignity while being questioned, struck her, almost instinctively. She tapped her camera on. The red light glowed faintly as she angled the phone discreetly. She wasn't sure what she might capture, but she had learned from campus protests and city hall meetings alike, sometimes documentation was the only defense against erasure. Xavier noticed the phone, but said nothing. He understood the power of witnesses, both silent and vocal. He thought of how often incidents like this were dismissed as misunderstandings when they went unseen. A camera, even one in a student's hands, could tilt the balance of truth. Derek leaned closer, lowering his voice but not enough to escape the reach of nearby ears. "You know, they're just doing their job," he said, as if offering sage advice. "If you really belong here, it shouldn't be a big deal to prove it." Xavier turned his head slowly, meeting Derek's eyes. His gaze was steady, unwavering. "I've already proven it," he said quietly. "Twice." His voice carried the weight of finality, yet it was free of anger. It was the calm of a man who had rehearsed dignity his entire life. For a moment Derek faltered, blinking rapidly, before shifting uncomfortably in his seat. He returned to his magazine, but his ears burned red. The cabin door opened again. Paula returned, this time with a taller woman wearing a navy blazer and a badge that marked her as a supervisor. Martha Green. Her expression was professional, yet her eyes held a flicker of weariness. She had likely been called into countless disputes, some petty, some serious. But as she approached row 2, she glanced at Xavier with the quick assessment of someone trying to solve a problem before understanding it. "Sir," she began, "we've been alerted to a possible ticketing issue. I'll need to see some identification along with your boarding pass." The request was framed politely, but its subtext was unmistakable. A man already seated, already verified, was once again being asked to justify his presence. Around them, passengers had grown silent, attention locked on the unfolding confrontation. The hum of the engines and the hiss of the ventilation seemed louder in the absence of conversation. Xavier drew a slow breath. His mind split in two directions. One part urged patience, telling him to comply once more, to produce his driver's license, to let the machine grind forward until it finally recognized what should have been obvious. The other part burned with refusal, warning that every act of compliance carved away at his dignity, leaving less to defend the next time. He thought of his daughter's face, her question about belonging, her wide eyes searching for reassurance. What would she think if she knew he had been asked 3 times in 15 minutes to prove himself worthy of sitting in a seat he had purchased? Would she see patience or surrender? Would she understand the cost of each silence with deliberate calm? He pulled out his wallet and slid his ID from its slot. He handed it along with the boarding pass to Martha. She examined both, eyes darting between the photo and the man before her. Her expression softened almost imperceptibly, though not enough to erase the damage already done. She handed them back, forcing a smile. "Thank you, Mr. Cole. Just a precaution." Xavier nodded once, slipping the items back into his pocket. He said nothing. Sometimes silence was its own statement. But Jade's phone was still recording, her live stream already climbing to thousands of viewers. Comments scrolled across her screen. He already showed his ticket. Why is he being singled out? This is what traveling while black looks like. Jade bit her lip, adrenaline surging as she realized the story was leaving the cabin, spilling into the digital world beyond. Martha turned to Paula, murmured something inaudible, then walked back toward the galley. Paula lingered a moment longer, glancing at Xavier with an expression caught between defiance and discomfort. Then she followed. The cabin slowly exhaled. Passengers shifted back into their seats, though the air remained charged. Derek cleared his throat again, but said nothing further. Xavier leaned back, closing his eyes briefly, his hands resting on the armrests. He breathed in deeply, steadying himself. The storm was not over. It was only beginning. The low thrum of the engines pulsed beneath the cabin floor, steady and constant, a reminder that this journey was meant to begin minutes ago. Instead, an uneasy quiet had settled over first class. The passengers shifted in their seats, pretending to read, pretending to scroll through their phones, but their eyes betrayed them. Their attention gravitated toward row 2, where the air felt heavier, denser, as if the weight of the entire aircraft had settled there. Martha Green returned, her navy blazer crisp, her badge catching the faint overhead light. She carried the kind of authority that came not from warmth, but from practiced posture. A spine stiffened by years of enforcing rules and absorbing passenger complaints. She paused by the galley, conferred quickly with Paula, then made her way toward Xavier's seat. Her shoes clicked softly against the aisle floor, each step pulling the eyes of nearby passengers toward her like a magnet. "Mr. Cole," she said, stopping beside him, voice firm but not raised. "I'd like to speak with you for a moment." Xavier opened his eyes slowly. His calm was deliberate, cultivated, the opposite of what the situation seemed to demand. "I'm listening," he said. Martha shifted slightly, aware of the audience forming around her, both in the cabin and, though she didn't yet realize it, in thousands of phones watching Jade's live stream. "There's been some irregularity flagged in the system regarding your seat assignment. We've checked your boarding pass, but for security reasons, I need to ask that you step aside with me until we can fully confirm the records." The words landed with a practiced neutrality, but their implication was not lost on anyone. To ask a man already seated in first class to stand, in front of peers, was to imply illegitimacy, to suggest that his place was uncertain, conditional, pending approval. Xavier leaned back slightly, studying her face. He saw the lines of fatigue at the edges of her eyes, the rigid set of her mouth. He wondered if she even believed the words she was speaking, or if she had simply surrendered to the machinery of protocol, letting it carry her along. He thought of his own employees, engineers, who sometimes defended buggy code by claiming the system had flagged it. But he had always insisted that behind every system was a human choice. Here, too, a choice was being made. "I have nothing further to show you," Xavier replied softly. "I've presented my boarding pass. I've shown my ID. I'm in the seat assigned to me. If the system can't reconcile that, then the system is flawed." Martha's jaw tightened. She was used to compliance, not quiet resistance. "Sir, I understand your frustration, but if you don't cooperate, we may be forced to delay the flight." A murmur rippled through the cabin. Passengers glanced at one another, some frowning, others whispering. The delay was no longer a hypothetical. It was beginning to take shape. And the cause, at least in the narrative being offered, was the man in 2A. Derek Lawson seized the moment. He turned slightly in his seat, speaking just loudly enough for others to hear. "You know, this could all be avoided if people just followed instructions. They're just doing their job. Why make it harder for everyone else?" The words were dipped in condescension, the kind of statement that cloaked itself in reasonableness while carrying a barbed edge. A few passengers nodded faintly, eager for someone to voice their own discomfort. Others looked away, unwilling to be pulled into the current. Xavier turned his head toward Derek, eyes steady. For a long moment, he said nothing, letting the silence stretch until it became heavier than words. Then, quietly, he answered, "Following instructions is easy. Defending dignity is harder." The line hung in the air, quiet but resonant. Even Jade, holding her phone in her lap, felt the words lodge in her chest. She zoomed slightly, capturing the calm resolve on Xavier's face as he spoke. Comments streamed across her screen. "This is unbelievable. Why's he the only one asked to move? Respect is not conditional." Martha cleared her throat, trying to regain control of the moment. "Mr. Cole, I am not questioning your character. I'm simply ensuring protocol is followed." "Protocol," Xavier repeated, almost to himself. The word rolled bitterly across his tongue. How often had that word been used as a shield, a justification, a way to transform prejudice into procedure? He looked at her again. Protocols exist to serve people, not the other way around. If your process forces you to humiliate someone who has already complied, then it's not a protocol, it's an excuse. Martha's face tightened. She wasn't accustomed to passengers dissecting her words, exposing the hollow spaces behind them. She shifted uncomfortably, glancing back toward Paula as if to seek reinforcement. But Paula's expression betrayed its own cracks, a hint of doubt creeping into her otherwise stiff facade. The tension pressed against the cabin walls. Passengers shifted, phones lifted a little higher, whispers weaving into a nervous hum. The flight that was meant to carry them smoothly across the country now felt like it had become a theater where something larger than travel was unfolding. Xavier's mind flickered back to his daughter. He imagined her sitting at home, scrolling through her phone, stumbling upon a live stream where her father was being told, again and again, to prove himself. He imagined her wide eyes filling with confusion, with disappointment. The thought cut deeper than the scrutiny itself. He had promised her that dignity required defense. And now, in this cabin, the promise was being tested. Derek broke the silence again, his impatience rising. "For God's sake, just get him another seat. Put him in the back if it makes things easier. Some of us actually have work to do when we land." Gasps and murmurs flared. Tiana Brooks, the young mother in 3D, turned in her seat, her voice sharp. Excuse me. He has every right to sit here. Why should he be moved just to make you comfortable? Derek looked startled, then defensive. I'm just saying no, Tiana interrupted, her tone unwavering. You're saying out loud what too many people think quietly, that some of us don't belong in the same spaces as others? Well, I'm not raising my son to accept that. Her toddler stirred in her arms, blinking sleepily as if even he could sense the charge in the air. Jade's camera shifted slightly, capturing Tiana's words as well, her fierce expression as she defended the man in 2A. The comments on her live stream spiked, voices from around the world pouring in. She's right. This is what solidarity looks like. Don't back down. Martha's composure faltered. She hadn't expected the passengers to divide so visibly. She hadn't expected resistance to ripple outward from one man's calm refusal to comply. The situation was no longer contained. It was growing, branching into social media, into the consciousness of everyone on board. Xavier exhaled slowly, his voice soft but firm. I'm not moving. I've met every requirement, provided every document, satisfied every demand. If this flight cannot leave because I refuse to stand again and justify myself, then the delay is not mine. It belongs to those who can't see what's already in front of them. For a long moment, the supervisor said nothing. She studied him, her mouth set, her eyes conflicted. Then she turned and walked back down the aisle, phone in hand, her steps quick and clipped. Paula followed, casting one last uneasy glance over her shoulder. The cabin released a collective breath. Conversations erupted in hushed tones. Some voices were sympathetic, others exasperated, but all recognized that the air had shifted. Something irreversible had begun. Xavier leaned back, closing his eyes briefly. The storm was gathering, and he could feel its electricity in his bones. He knew the next move would not be his alone. Jade Nguyen kept her phone angled carefully, her hand steady despite the tremor of adrenaline rushing through her veins. At first she thought she was only recording for her own conscience, a small insurance against the possibility that this moment would be brushed aside as a simple misunderstanding. But when she tapped the live stream button, almost without thinking, the numbers at the corner of her screen began to climb. 10 viewers, 50, 200. Within minutes, the count shot past 1,000, then 3,000. The comments scrolled in a blur, voices from living rooms and offices and subway cars far beyond this cabin. She whispered to herself, almost in disbelief, "They're seeing this." The lens caught Xavier sitting in 2A, his posture calm, his face composed, yet lined with a quiet strain. It caught Derek beside him, stiff and defensive. It caught Paula and Martha conferring near the galley with worried glances. The world outside the cabin was beginning to witness the theater inside it. Tiana Brooks rocked her toddler in her arms and leaned slightly toward Xavier. "Don't let them wear you down," she said softly, her voice low but steady. "You shouldn't have to keep proving yourself. None of us should." Xavier offered her a gentle nod. He appreciated the courage it took to speak up in a room where silence was safer. Her words felt like a hand extended across a widening gap, a reminder that he was not alone, even as the pressure mounted. Derek shifted uncomfortably in his seat, sensing the tide of the cabin turning against him. He muttered, "This is ridiculous. People blow everything out of proportion these days." His voice carried enough to be caught by Jade's microphone. Comments immediately erupted. "We hear you. Derek, this is why people stay silent." Same script, every time. A middle-aged man across the aisle leaned forward, whispering to his wife, "She's filming this. That's going to cause trouble." The wife shook her head slowly. "Maybe trouble is what's needed." The captain's voice came over the intercom then, calm and measured, trying to reassure. Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing a brief delay due to a verification issue. Please remain seated and we'll update you shortly. His words were professional, stripped of detail, but every ear in the cabin knew exactly what the verification issue referred to. Jade angled her camera upward, catching the reactions of passengers as the announcement ended. Faces revealed more than they meant to irritation, sympathy, indifference, quiet outrage. It was as though each person was being forced to choose a side, even if only in the privacy of their thoughts. Xavier folded his hands in his lap. He had not spoken since Martha's last approach, but silence was no longer just his strategy. It had become a canvas onto which others were projecting their own truths. His stillness contrasted with the noise building around him, a noise that was no longer contained within the aluminum walls of the aircraft. Jade leaned slightly forward, her voice steady now, infused with purpose. "This is happening on Redwood Air Flight 372, she said into the camera. "A man in first class is being asked again and again to prove his right to sit in the seat he paid for. He has complied. He has shown his documents. Yet they continue to question him. Ask yourself why." Her words crackled across digital space, carried into thousands of devices. Within moments, her live stream was shared across social media platforms. Hashtags began to sprout like wildfire. C2A trended within 20 minutes. Screens in newsrooms across the country flickered as producers noticed the spike. What had begun as a confrontation in a single cabin was transforming into a national conversation in real time. Back in the cabin, Martha returned, her phone pressed to her ear. She was receiving instructions from headquarters, though her voice was low and clipped. Passengers leaned forward, trying to catch fragments. Her eyes kept darting toward Xavier, then to Jade, then back again. She knew the control of this moment was slipping. The power was no longer solely in her hands. Tiana's toddler began fussing, small cries bubbling up as the tension in the room seeped into him. She hushed him gently, rocking him against her shoulder. She looked across the aisle at Xavier again. "They think they can wear you down," she murmured. "But the truth doesn't need permission to stand." Xavier felt the weight of her support, but he also felt the burden of expectation pressing harder. It wasn't only about him anymore. It was about everyone watching, both inside this cabin and far beyond. He thought briefly of his daughter, scrolling through her phone at home, maybe already seeing the hashtags, maybe realizing that her father's words about dignity were not just theories, but lived battles. Derek broke the moment with another sharp comment. If he really is who he says he is, why not just cooperate until it's sorted out? Why drag everyone else into it? Xavier turned to him slowly, his expression calm, but his eyes carrying the quiet burn of a man who had been tested too many times. "Because silence teaches the wrong lesson," he said. "It teaches that doubt is justified when it isn't. It teaches that dignity can be suspended until proven otherwise. I won't teach that." His words were measured, spoken almost softly. Yet they carried through the cabin. Even those who disagreed with him felt their impact. The silence that followed was thicker than before, layered with the knowledge that something irreversible had just been spoken aloud. Jade's screen lit up with a flood of comments. "This is the line in the sand. That's the truth right there. Never silence yourself for their comfort." Martha ended her call and returned, her face pale with tension. She addressed Xavier again, though her voice had lost some of its firmness. "Mr. Cole, we're working to resolve the issue. In the meantime, we ask for your patience." "I've been patient," he replied evenly. "What I won't be is silent." The distinction struck her like a blow. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, realizing perhaps for the first time that protocol was not enough to contain this situation. The cameras, the passengers, the momentum, none of it could be rolled back. The engines continued to hum beneath the cabin, steady and waiting. Outside, the ground crew had already finished their tasks. The aircraft was ready. The only thing holding it back was the weight of an unresolved truth, a truth that one man had decided would no longer be deferred. Jade's live stream passed 10,000 viewers, then 20, then 50. News outlets began embedding the feed, reporters scrambling to identify the man in seat 2A. The wider world was no longer just a spectator, it was an active participant. The cabin of Flight 372 had become a stage, and the story of who belonged where was being written in real time. Xavier closed his eyes briefly, drawing a slow breath. He could feel the storm gathering. He could hear it in the whispers, in the rustle of phones, in the restless shifting of passengers. The next move would be decisive, not just for him, but for an airline, for a narrative, for the countless people who knew what it meant to be doubted without reason. He opened his eyes again, gaze steady, posture calm. Whatever was coming, he was ready to meet it without flinching. The cabin felt like it was holding its breath. Outside the window, dusk had settled fully over the tarmac, streaks of violet and burnt orange fading into night. The aircraft lights flickered against the glass, casting reflections that trembled faintly with each movement of the passengers. Inside, the tension had grown thick enough to taste. Every glance, every whispered comment seemed to circle back to the man in 2A and the question hanging in the air. What would he do next? Xavier Cole sat motionless, his hands folded in his lap. He had learned long ago that stillness could command more attention than noise. His silence wasn't resignation, it was preparation. He listened to the shuffle of feet in the aisle, the coughs and sighs of weary travelers, the muted whir of Jade's phone camera capturing every frame. He could sense the gaze of the supervisor from the galley, Paula's restless movements just behind the curtain, Derek's impatient fidgeting beside him. They were all waiting, and so was he. At last. Paula returned, her jaw tight, tablet clutched in her hand like a shield. She stopped at row 2, her voice low but edged with authority. Mr. Cole, we're still unable to clear the discrepancy. Until it's resolved, you'll need to wait off the aircraft. Her words landed like a stone in a still pond. The ripples spread instantly, gasps from a few passengers, murmurs from others. Derek let out a small sound of satisfaction, as though his irritation had been validated. Tiana's head snapped around sharply, her eyes wide with disbelief. Jade adjusted her phone, her pulse racing as she realized this was the moment. Xavier remained seated, eyes fixed calmly on Paula. You're asking me to leave my seat. His voice was quiet, but it carried, for the time being. Paula answered quickly. Until we can confirm. He nodded slowly, as though turning the idea over in his mind. For a few seconds, he allowed silence to fill the space. He wanted every person in the cabin to feel the weight of what had just been demanded of him. He wanted them to understand it wasn't just about a seat. It was about the presumption beneath it. Finally, he spoke. Do you know what system checks your boarding passes? He asked, his tone even. Do you know what platform processes your passenger data, assigns your seating, coordinates your crew schedules, tracks your maintenance logs? Paula blinked, thrown by the unexpected turn. That's not relevant, she said quickly. It's more relevant than you realize. Xavier replied. He turned his gaze to Derek, who had gone very still, then to the passengers across the aisle. His voice remained calm, almost conversational, but its resonance drew every ear. The system you are depending on, the one you are citing to question me, is my system. My company built it. The algorithms running beneath this very aircraft's operations are written by engineers I employ. The words hung in the air like a spark in dry brush. For a moment, silence reigned, stunned and disbelieving. Then whispers erupted, darting back and forth across the cabin. Did he just say he built the system? What does that mean? Paula's face flushed, a mix of confusion and disbelief. She looked at Martha, who had stepped closer, her expression tightening as she realized the situation was veering beyond her grasp. "Sir, whatever your company does, that doesn't exempt you from procedure." Xavier tilted his head, studying her. "You're right, it doesn't exempt me, but it does mean that citing a system error to justify repeated suspicion isn't just insulting. It's absurd. Because if the system is flawed, then you are questioning the man who can fix it. And if the system isn't flawed, then you are questioning me because of something else entirely." The murmurs grew louder, passengers shifting in their seats. Jade's phone captured every second, the comments on her live stream exploding. He built the system. Oh, they picked the wrong guy today. This is bigger than one seat. Derek's smirk faltered. He looked at Xavier, searching for some sign that it was bluster. But the calm certainty in Xavier's voice, the unhurried cadence, the absolute lack of defensiveness, it all carried the weight of truth. Derek looked away, suddenly fascinated by the safety card in the seat pocket. Tiana's toddler let out a soft cry, and she hushed him quickly. She glanced at Xavier with something like awe. "You don't have to prove anything," she said softly, but her words trembled with the recognition that he already had. Paula swallowed hard, her composure fraying. She had entered this confrontation believing she held authority, believing protocol was her armor. But protocol was now crumbling beneath her, exposed for what it was, a convenient shield for suspicion, and the man she had tried to unseat had just pulled the shield away with a single revelation. Martha stepped forward, her voice strained but steady. "Mr. Cole, let's remain professional, whether or not your company provides services. We have procedures to follow. Please cooperate so we can get this flight underway." Xavier regarded her carefully. He could see the calculation in her eyes, the recognition that this was no longer a simple dispute with a passenger. This was something larger, something that might ripple far beyond the cabin if it wasn't contained. He felt the weight of the decision pressing against him, continued to endure the questioning, or shift the balance entirely. His mind flickered to his daughter again, her voice asking why people looked at him as though he didn't belong. He thought of his father, silent on the train decades earlier. He thought of the millions of people who had lived their lives shadowed by suspicion, asked to justify their presence in spaces they had earned 100 times over. He felt the old anger rise, tempered by years of discipline, sharpened into something more potent than rage resolve. "I have complied," he said quietly, more than once. "I've shown what was asked, and yet the suspicion continues. This is not about procedure anymore. This is about dignity, and dignity does not wait for permission." The words struck the cabin like a bell, clear and resonant. Passengers exchanged glances, some nodding faintly, others shifting uncomfortably. Jade felt goosebumps prickle her skin as she whispered into the camera, "You're hearing this live. Remember his words. Dignity does not wait for permission, for the first time." Paula faltered completely. She opened her mouth, closed it again, then retreated toward the galley. Martha followed, phone pressed to her ear, her voice low and urgent as she spoke to someone far away, someone who might have more power but also more to lose. Xavier leaned back in his seat, exhaling slowly. He had not raised his voice, not moved from his chair, yet the balance of power in the cabin had shifted palpably. He could feel it in the way Derek sat rigid and silent, in the way Tiana looked at him with quiet gratitude, in the way Jade's camera lingered on his calm face as if it were the center of gravity for the entire scene. The engines continued their steady hum, patient and waiting. Outside, the runway lights flickered, stretching into the distance like lines of possibility. Inside, the man in 2A had revealed just enough of his truth to change the direction of what was to come. The air in the cabin had become charged, as though every molecule trembled with anticipation. Passengers no longer pretended to read or scroll on their phones. They were watching openly now, their gazes flicking between the galley curtain and the man seated quietly in 2A. The silence was tense, but it was not empty. It was the silence that comes just before a storm breaks. From the galley, Paula emerged again, her face flushed, her steps clipped and quick. She carried the phone in one hand, her voice hushed but urgent. When she reached row 2, her composure was brittle. She cleared her throat and announced, "Sir, we've contacted ground security. They'll be here shortly to assist with the situation." The words were sharp, cutting through the low hum of the engines. A few passengers gasped. Others groaned audibly, realizing the delay was about to lengthen, that they were about to be trapped inside a standoff rather than transported across the country. Derek Lawson seized the moment with a sigh of exasperation. "Well, that's just great," he muttered loudly. "Now we'll be sitting here all night because someone can't follow simple directions." Jade's camera tilted slightly, capturing Derek's sneer, then swinging back to Xavier, who remained calm, his face unreadable. Her live stream chat lit up in real time. "They called security for what? Unbelievable. This man is handling it with more grace than anyone deserves." Xavier's gaze remained fixed on Paula, though his voice was measured. "You've called security for a man sitting in his assigned seat, holding a valid boarding pass, after presenting his ID multiple times, sir." "Please lower your voice," Paula snapped, her tone betraying her fraying nerves. "This is for everyone's safety." "I haven't raised my voice," Xavier replied softly. His calmness only deepened the contrast between his presence and the frantic energy swirling around him. Martha appeared a moment later, her phone still in hand, her expression tight. She whispered urgently to Paula, but Jade's phone microphone picked up fragments: headquarters, optics, live stream. Martha's eyes darted toward Jade, widening when she realized just how many eyes might already be on them. Derek leaned forward, his patience gone. "Why are we entertaining this? Just move him. It's not complicated. Some people think rules don't apply to them, and the rest of us have to pay for it." Xavier turned to him then, slowly, deliberately. His gaze was steady, his tone almost gentle. "The rules apply to everyone, but suspicion isn't a rule. It's a choice, and I won't validate that choice with my silence." The words landed heavily, resonating through the cabin. For the first time, Derek had no quick retort. His mouth opened, then closed again, as if he had run out of script. Jade whispered into her phone, "You're hearing this live. He's saying what so many of us have felt but never had the platform to speak." Her viewer count passed 100,000 comments, flooding in faster than she could read. "Stay strong. We see you. This is history in real time." Xavier drew a slow breath, reached into his pocket, and pulled out his phone. His movements were unhurried, intentional. He scrolled to a familiar contact, his chief operating officer. He didn't raise the device for spectacle. He simply pressed call, waited for the line to click open, and spoke 3 words. "Activate Protocol Echo." The cabin itself seemed to exhale in confusion. Derek frowned. Passengers glanced at one another, and even Paula's expression shifted from defiance to uncertainty. The words meant nothing to most of the people in the room, but their impact would be felt within minutes. Xavier ended the call, slid the phone back into his pocket, and folded his hands again. He didn't explain. He didn't need to. He had planted a quiet tremor that was already racing through the veins of the airline's network. In the control rooms of airports across the country, terminals slowed, the booking system hiccuped, lines of passengers stalled as screens froze and rebooted. Boarding groups halted mid-scan. Gates buzzed with confusion. Pilots waiting for updated manifests stared at blank displays. At Redwood Air's headquarters in Dallas, alarms began to chime, and a ripple of panic spread across the operations floor. Back in the cabin of Flight 372, Martha's phone buzzed violently in her hand. She glanced at the screen, her face paling. Paula leaned toward her, whispering urgently. The two women exchanged a frantic look before retreating briefly to the galley. Jade caught every moment. "Something's happening," she narrated softly. "They're reacting." He said 3 words, and they're reacting like the ground is shaking beneath them. Her audience count soared again. What did he just do? This is bigger than the plane. He's got them cornered. Tiana clutched her toddler closer, her eyes wide as she looked at Xavier. "What did you do?" she asked in a whisper, part awe, part fear. He turned to her gently. "I reminded them that respect isn't optional," he said. Derek snorted. "You can't seriously think you're going to shut down an airline with a phone call." But his voice wavered, betraying the uncertainty gnawing at him as he noticed Martha's pale face, Paula's anxious glances, and the growing buzz of tension from the back of the cabin as passengers began to realize something unusual was unfolding. The intercom crackled again. This time the captain's voice sounded less certain, tinged with forced calm. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing a technical issue that may cause some delay. We appreciate your patience as we work to resolve it." It was the bland language of crisis management, but the timing was damning. Jade's live stream captured it seamlessly, her commentary sharp. He makes one call, and the captain immediately announces a system issue. You put the pieces together. The passengers shifted uneasily, the atmosphere thick with disbelief and dawning recognition. Xavier sat still, his expression unreadable, his body language calm. He didn't gloat. He didn't raise his voice. He simply embodied the quiet power of someone who had chosen not to be dismissed. Paula returned once more, but her authority had evaporated. She looked at Xavier with a mixture of fear and resentment, as though she had just realized she had underestimated not only the man, but the leverage he carried. "Mr. Cole," she said, her voice less certain, "we're working to clarify everything with headquarters. Please, just remain seated." Xavier inclined his head slightly. "That's exactly what I've been doing." The passengers chuckled nervously, the tension breaking just enough for a ripple of recognition to pass through the cabin. They had watched a man stand his ground without leaving his seat, and now they understood he wasn't just defending a chair, he was defending principle, and he had the means to make that defense undeniable. The engines continued their patient hum as though they too were waiting for resolution. Outside, night had fully fallen, the runway lights stretching like stars against the black sky. Inside, the storm had broken, the flashpoint had been reached, and the balance of power no longer belonged to the crew, or even to the captain. It belonged to the man in 2A, at Redwood Air Headquarters in Dallas. The operations floor was usually a place of precision. Rows of screens glowed with flight paths, weather radar, crew schedules, and booking tallies. Dozens of controllers moved with calm efficiency, voices low but certain as they coordinated aircraft across the country. But tonight, a ripple of unease spread like a virus across the room. Screens froze. Logans failed. Booking counters at airports across 3 time zones began calling in, reporting that their terminals were unresponsive. The hum of routine had cracked, replaced by the discordant buzz of confusion. A young analyst waved frantically to her supervisor. "System lag on every gate terminal east of Denver," she said, panic threading her voice. "They're saying boarding groups can't be scanned. Check-ins are timing out." The supervisor leaned over her shoulder, frowning at the frozen screen. "Reboot it. I've tried. Twice." The analyst's voice wavered. "It's not local. It's system-wide." The supervisor picked up the phone, dialing quickly. Within minutes, the call had climbed 3 levels up the chain. On the executive floor, Richard Hanover, the airline's CEO, was pulled from a dinner with board members. He arrived in the control room, tie loosened, eyes sharp, scanning the room like a general surveying a battlefield. "Talk to me," he demanded. The chief of IT looked pale. "It's Echo," he said quietly. "Protocol Echo has been triggered." The words landed like a gunshot. Hanover's stomach dropped. He knew what Echo was. Every airline executive did. It was a contractual safeguard buried deep within the agreements with Coal Dynamics, the tech company that powered nearly every aspect of their infrastructure. Echo was not a hack. It was not sabotage. It was a kill switch built into the system, a way to ensure compliance if obligations were violated. It had never been used before. Until now. Hanover's voice was tight. Where originating from Baltimore, the IT chief said, "Flight 372, first-class passenger." Hanover froze, the pieces locking together. He didn't need to ask the name. He already knew who sat in that seat. He had met Xavier Cole once at a technology summit, the man quiet but unshakable, his handshake firm, his eyes clear. He had walked away with the uneasy sense that this was a man you did not cross lightly. Now the uneasy sense had hardened into reality. Hanover turned sharply to his communications director. "Get me the captain of that flight. Now." Then to legal counsel. "Draft immediate language on compliance and optics. If this goes public, we're finished." "It's already public," the IT chief muttered, showing a tablet where Jade Nguyen's live stream ran. The viewer count climbed in real time, a blur of numbers racing higher. Hanover stared at the feed, his heart sinking as he saw Xavier sitting calmly in 2A, saying nothing, needing to say nothing. The world was already watching. Back on the aircraft, Martha's phone buzzed violently in her hand. She stepped aside, pressing it to her ear, her expression strained. Paula hovered near her, eyes darting nervously around the cabin. Their whispers were too low to carry, but their body language betrayed everything: panic, disbelief, a dawning recognition that they were outmatched. Passengers shifted in their seats, restless, whispering. Some were sympathetic, others annoyed, but all could sense the shift. What had started as an uncomfortable dispute had escalated into something extraordinary. Derek sat stiffly beside Xavier, his earlier bravado fading into uneasy silence. He stared at his watch as if willing time to move faster, but time had slowed, trapped inside the hum of engines that refused to roar. Jade narrated quietly into her phone. "Viewers, the airline's headquarters is clearly reacting. We don't know what's happening on the ground, but their staff here just got a call. Look at their faces. They're realizing he has leverage they never imagined." The comments surged in response. "This is history. Never seen anything like it. He's teaching the whole industry a lesson." Martha finally lowered her phone, her face pale. She approached Xavier with hesitation, her voice unsteady. "Mr. Cole, we're in communication with headquarters. They are aware of the situation. We ask that you remain calm while we work toward resolution." "I have been calm," Xavier said simply. He folded his hands in his lap again, his tone steady. "The question is whether your system and your people can match it. Paula bit her lip, struggling to maintain composure. Her eyes darted to Jade's phone, then back to Xavier. She looked like someone caught in a trap of her own making, realizing too late that the bars were built from choices, not chance. Derek muttered again, though quieter this time, "All this for a seat." His words lacked conviction, sounding hollow, more for himself than anyone else. Tiana turned to him, her voice sharp. "No. All this for dignity. Don't confuse the two." The cabin buzzed with murmurs of agreement. For the first time, the weight of public opinion inside the plane shifted decisively toward Xavier. He had not raised his voice, had not moved from his seat, yet the tide had turned. He sat as still as a mountain, and everything else now revolved around him. In Dallas. Hanover pressed a hand to his forehead. The calls poured in, airport managers demanding answers, board members panicking about stock prices, news producers requesting statements. The communications director spoke urgently in his ear, "We need to get in front of this. We can't be the airline that dragged a black CEO off a plane while live streaming to hundreds of thousands of people." Hanover's jaw clenched. He knew what had to be done, but the humiliation of it burned. Still, humiliation was better than collapse. He took a breath, steeling himself. "Patch me through to the aircraft, directly to him." The operations team scrambled, connecting the line to the cockpit, then through to the cabin. Within minutes. Martha's phone buzzed again. She hesitated, then approached Xavier. "Mr. Cole," she said softly, "the CEO would like to speak with you." Xavier studied her for a moment, then extended his hand. She placed the phone in his palm like a reluctant offering. He lifted it to his ear, his posture unchanging. His voice was calm when he spoke. "This is Cole." For a moment, silence. Then Hanover's voice crackled through, tense but measured. "Mr. Cole, this is Richard Hanover. I believe we need to resolve this matter quickly." Xavier let the silence linger before answering. "Yes," he said. "We do." Every passenger in first class leaned forward slightly, sensing they were about to witness something extraordinary. Jade's phone captured it all, the live stream chat exploding with anticipation. Xavier had pulled the conflict out of the cabin and into the boardroom, and now the two worlds collided in real time. The hum of the engines continued, patient and waiting. The storm had moved to the highest level of the airline, but its epicenter remained right here in 2A, where a man sat quietly, prepared to hold his ground until dignity was no longer negotiable. The phone was warm in Xavier's hand, as if it carried not just voices, but the weight of the entire company pulsing through it. He sat upright, gaze fixed on the seat in front of him, every line of his posture calm but unyielding. The passengers around him leaned closer in their seats without even realizing it, their curiosity pulling them forward like a tide. Jade angled her phone carefully, her live stream audience swelling past 200,000, comments rushing by in a blur. On the other end of the line, Richard Hanover inhaled deeply before speaking. His voice was controlled, clipped, the sound of a man used to negotiating contracts worth billions. "Mr. Cole," he began, "I think we both know the current disruption isn't sustainable. I need you to stand down. Whatever grievance exists, we can address it through proper channels after the flight." Xavier's lips curved into something that was not quite a smile. "Proper channels," he repeated softly. "Is that what you call humiliating a man in front of a cabin full of witnesses? Is that what you call asking for ID after ID until dignity becomes conditional? You may call it procedure. I call it something else." There was a pause on the line, filled by the sound of Hanover's exhale. "Look, Mr. Cole, I respect you, and I respect the work your company does, but this," his voice hardened, "this is damaging both of us. You and I have mutual interests. Let's not burn them." Xavier's eyes closed briefly as he inhaled. Centering himself, his voice, when it came, was calm, steady, and sharp enough to cut glass. "Mr. Hanover, you speak of damage, but the damage did not begin when I made a phone call. It began when your staff decided that my presence was suspicious. It began when protocol became an excuse for prejudice. What you are experiencing now is not damage. It is consequence." A silence stretched across the line. In the cabin, the passengers could feel the electricity of the exchange even without hearing Hanover's side. They saw the way Xavier's face remained composed, the way his voice carried authority without raising. They saw Martha watching nervously from the galley, Paula shrinking into the shadows, Derek staring wide-eyed at the armrest as if wishing he could disappear into it. Hanover's voice returned, lower, almost pleading. "What do you want?" Xavier opened his eyes, his gaze clear and unflinching. "3 things," he said, his tone measured. First, a public apology not whispered, not buried in a press release, but spoken aloud to this cabin and issued formally to the public. Second, comprehensive reform in your training and oversight, anti-bias protocols, accountability systems, measures that ensure no passenger is made to prove their humanity 3 times before they are allowed to sit down. Third, a community fund, $20 million administered independently, dedicated to advancing underrepresented youth in aviation and technology. Because dignity is not restored with words alone. It must be invested in. The cabin felt the words land like stones in a still pond, rippling outward. Jade's viewers erupted in comments, exclamation marks flooding the feed. He's not just asking for himself, he's demanding systemic change. 20 million fund, this is history. This is how you leverage power for good. Hanover was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his tone was tense. You're asking for public humiliation of the company, sweeping reform that will cost millions, and a fund that will cost millions more. Do you understand what you're demanding I do? Xavier replied evenly. And I understand something else. You are not negotiating with me. You are negotiating with your survival. The system you rely on is already slowing. Within the hour, it will not simply delay flights. It will ground them. Tens of thousands of passengers stranded, millions in losses. The question is not whether you can afford my demands. The question is whether you can afford not to meet them. The bluntness of his words sent a chill through the cabin. Even those who couldn't hear Hanover's side understood what was being said. Xavier was not threatening. He was stating fact, delivered with the calm inevitability of gravity. Hanover's voice sharpened, the edge of desperation creeping in. You're holding an airline hostage. No, Xavier said softly. I'm holding a mirror. What you see in it is your own reflection. If you don't like it, perhaps you should change. The passengers stirred, the air thick with awe and disbelief. Derek shifted uncomfortably, mumbling, "This is insane." Tiana shot him a look that silenced him instantly. Her toddler stirred against her chest, and she whispered, almost to herself, "He's fighting for all of us." On the live stream, Jade's whisper carried over the feed. He just laid down 3 demands, and the CEO is on the other end of this call. We're watching leverage become justice in real time. Hanover's voice, when it returned, was clipped and angry. If I agree to this, you'll deactivate Echo. When the commitments are real, Xavier replied, not before. An apology delivered in this cabin, reforms announced within a month, and the fund established within 3. Those are the terms. Anything less is noise. The line went quiet again. somewhere in Dallas. Richard Hanover was calculating. He thought of stock prices, of shareholder fury, of public outrage spreading by the second through Jade's feed. He thought of competitors waiting to pounce on weakness, of regulators watching, of passengers whispering about boycotts. He thought of his own reputation, his legacy, the possibility of being remembered as the CEO who let arrogance and prejudice unravel an empire. When he finally spoke, his voice was strained, the fight drained. "I'll do it." Xavier nodded once, his face still composed. "Then, let's begin with the apology. You may start with this cabin." Martha's eyes widened. She realized instantly what that meant. Hanover's words would come through her, through Paula, through the staff who had set this fire. There was no hiding, no redirecting. The accountability would be public and immediate. Hanover's voice tightened. "Put the supervisor back on the line." Xavier extended the phone toward Martha, who accepted it with trembling hands. She pressed it to her ear, listening for a moment, then lowered it slowly, her face pale. She turned toward the passengers, her voice faltering. "On behalf of Redwood Air, we sincerely apologize to Mr. Cole for the treatment he has received this evening. It was wrong, it was unjustified, and it will not happen again." Her words shook, but they carried through the cabin like thunder. The passengers shifted, whispers rising, some clapping softly in tentative recognition. Paula stood frozen, her face flushed with shame. Derek stared at the floor. Tiana's eyes filled with quiet tears as she murmured. Finally, Jade captured every second, her phone trembling now as her live stream audience crossed 300,000. Comments flooded the feed. Accountability in real time. This is what justice looks like. History is happening in this cabin. Xavier remained still, his face calm, but in his chest a deep breath swelled. He had not won yet the reforms, and the fund were still to come, but this was the first step. For himself, for his daughter, for everyone who had ever been asked to prove their worthiness to simply sit where they belonged. The engines hummed, steady and patient, as though the aircraft itself had been waiting for this moment before it could finally take flight. The cabin seemed to tilt on its axis, as if the apology Martha had just delivered had shifted gravity itself. For a long, suspended moment, no one moved. The words lingered in the recycled air, heavy and undeniable. It was wrong. It was unjustified. It will not happen again. Those words did not erase what had happened, but they cracked open a door that had been locked for far too long. Xavier sat perfectly still, his hands folded on his lap, the phone resting on the armrest beside him. His composure had not wavered once, but inside him a current of memory and purpose surged. He thought of his father on that train decades ago, swallowing his silence as his son watched. He thought of his daughter's question, "Why do they look at you like you don't belong?" and knew that tonight he had answered her, not with explanation, but with action. The applause began hesitantly, a single pair of hands clapping somewhere near row 3. Then another joined, and another, until the cabin filled with the sound of recognition. It was not thunderous, not wild, but steady, a rhythm of solidarity. Tiana Brooks clapped with one hand while holding her son with the other, tears sliding down her face. Even those who had shifted uncomfortably earlier now found themselves caught in the moment. Their own complicity reflected back at them in the supervisor's trembling apology. Derek Lawson remained stiff, his arms folded tightly across his chest, his face pale. He muttered something under his breath, but no one was listening anymore. The tide had turned, and he was stranded on the wrong shore. Paula, who had been the first to challenge Xavier, stood frozen, Her lips were pressed tightly together, her eyes darting between Xavier and the passengers, applauding. She looked like someone waking from a dream into a nightmare, realizing too late that the authority she wielded had collapsed under its own weight. Martha glanced at her sharply, then spoke again, her voice firmer this time. "Ms. Whitman," she said, "you have something to add." Paula swallowed, her throat working visibly. She stepped forward, her voice low and halting. "Mr. Cole," she began, I apologize for questioning you the way I did. It was unprofessional, and it was wrong." Her words trembled, lacking conviction, but they were spoken aloud. Xavier inclined his head slightly, acknowledging without embellishment. "Apology noted," he said softly. His calmness seemed almost otherworldly, as though nothing could shake him. Yet beneath that calm was a fire, a truth burning steady. He was not here for humiliation or revenge. He was here for accountability. Jade's phone captured every second. Her live stream had crossed 500,000 viewers, the comments pouring faster than she could read. They apologized in front of everyone. History in seat 2A. This is how dignity looks when it's defended. Show this to every airline. The intercom crackled to life again, the captain's voice cautious but deliberate. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. We're preparing for departure shortly. Redwood Air wishes to assure you that we are committed to the dignity and respect of all our passengers." His tone was careful, as though each word had been weighed, approved, and handed to him by someone far above. The passengers shifted again, a new energy settling into the cabin. It was not relaxation, not yet, but a release of tension. They had witnessed something raw and unfiltered, and they knew instinctively it would travel far beyond this aircraft. Xavier reached for the phone again, speaking briefly into the receiver. "You've made the first step, Mr. Hanover. The others must follow." On the other end, the CEO's voice carried defeat wrapped in professionalism. "They will. I'll see to it personally. We'll announce reforms within the month." And the fund, he paused, as if swallowing the size of the concession. "The fund will be established within 3. Xavier closed his eyes briefly, absorbing the words. When he opened them, he placed the phone gently on the armrest. He had heard promises before, promises made to be broken, but this time the world was listening. Jade's live stream had ensured it. The commitments would be recorded, dissected, replayed endlessly. Silence could no longer bury them. Beside him, Derek leaned over, his voice low, almost pleading. "You didn't have to go this far," he muttered. "You could have just shown them what they wanted and spared us all this circus." Xavier turned his head slowly, his gaze steady. "If I had done that," he said softly, "you'd have learned that silence is enough to erase dignity, and I will not teach that lesson." Derek flinched, his face flushing, but he had no reply. Tiana leaned across the aisle, her son now sleeping against her shoulder. Her voice carried gratitude and conviction. "Thank you," she whispered, "for showing him, for showing all of us." Jade's viewers erupted again. "This isn't just a fight for one man. It's for all of us who've been made to feel small. Seat 2A will be remembered." Never underestimate calm power. The hum of the engines deepened as the aircraft finally began to push back from the gate. Passengers straightened in their seats, buckling belts, stowing phones, though many still kept their eyes on Xavier, as though afraid to miss a single detail. He remained serene, gazing out the window at the night beyond the tarmac. The reflection in the glass showed not just his face, but the cabin behind him, rows of witnesses, each carrying a piece of what had happened here. As the plane began to taxi, Martha approached one final time, her voice low, almost personal. "Mr. Cole, I don't expect forgiveness, but I will say this. You've changed something tonight. More than you realize." Xavier regarded her for a long moment. His expression softened, though his words remained measured. Change is never comfortable, but it's always necessary. She nodded, eyes downcast, before returning to the galley. Paula remained silent, her eyes fixed on the floor, her authority dissolved into shame. The cabin lights dimmed as the plane turned toward the runway. The silence that followed was no longer heavy with tension, but with reflection. Passengers stared at their laps, their phones, the sleeping child in 3D. They knew instinctively that they had been part of something larger than a delayed flight. Something that would be written about, dissected, debated. Jade whispered to her camera, her voice steady despite the tears she hadn't realized were forming. "This is not the end. This is the beginning." He didn't just defend his seat. He defended dignity. And now, the world has to listen. Her viewer count passed 1 million as the plane accelerated down the runway, lifting into the night sky. The roar of takeoff filled the cabin, shaking the walls, pressing bodies into their seats. Yet, even against that thunder, the quiet strength of one man's refusal to move still echoed louder. Xavier closed his eyes, the vibration of ascent humming through his body. He felt the aircraft rise, carrying him and every witness into the dark expanse above. The fight was not finished, but for the first time in years, he felt a small measure of peace. The silence was no longer suffocating. It was powerful, and far below, in living rooms and offices across the country, millions of people now carried the same thought. If dignity could be defended in Seat 2A, then perhaps it could be defended anywhere. Weeks passed, but the events of Flight 372 refused to fade. What had unfolded in that first-class cabin spread far beyond the narrow aisles of the aircraft. Jade Nguyen's live stream had been replayed millions of times across every platform imaginable. News anchors dissected it. Late-night hosts quoted Xavier's words with awe. Civil rights leaders called it a turning point. Even in classrooms, teachers paused their lessons to play the video of the calm man in Seat 2A refusing to surrender his dignity. For Redwood Air, the fallout was swift and merciless. Stock prices dipped sharply as outrage spread, passengers canceling flights, investors questioning the company's judgment. Within days, CEO Richard Hanover faced a press conference unlike any he had ever known. Cameras flashed as he stood at a podium, flanked by executives and lawyers, his tie perfectly knotted but his expression grim. "We failed," he said into the microphones. "We failed one of our passengers. We failed our values. And we failed the trust that the public places in us. On behalf of Redwood Air, I offer a direct and unconditional apology to Dr. Xavier Cole." The words rippled through the crowd of journalists, many of whom had already seen the apology forced on the aircraft itself. But this was different. This was public. This was recorded for history. Hanover's jaw tightened as he continued. "Effective immediately. Redwood Air is instituting mandatory anti-bias and accountability training for all employees, from ground staff to senior leadership. We are overhauling our incident reporting system to ensure transparency. And, as agreed, we are establishing the Redwood Cole Foundation, a $20 million initiative dedicated to supporting underrepresented youth pursuing careers in aviation and technology." The announcement made headlines across the globe. Commentators called it unprecedented. A corporate capitulation forged not through lawsuits or government orders, but through one man's refusal to move from his seat. The Redwood Cole Foundation quickly became a symbol, drawing applications and support from students, universities, and community leaders. The name itself carried weight. a reminder of where the money had come from and why. Meanwhile, Paula Whitman's life changed in ways she could not have imagined. Removed from flight duty, she faced an internal review that ended with termination. The footage of her questioning Xavier was dissected endlessly online. Her face turned into a symbol of misplaced authority. At first, she bristled with defensiveness, telling friends she had only followed procedure. But the silence of those friends, the judgment in their eyes, forced her to confront what she had done. Alone in her apartment, watching the footage replayed, she heard the sharpness of her own tone, saw the suspicion in her stance. She began to understand what had been obvious to everyone else. She had not been following procedure. She had been following prejudice. Martha Greene's path was different. She had survived the fallout, but not without scars. Hanover kept her on, citing her cooperation in delivering the in-cabin apology, but she was reassigned to administrative work, far from passengers. At first she felt humiliated, stripped of the authority she had once wielded easily. Yet, over time, the distance gave her space to reflect. She began attending the very training sessions the company now mandated, sitting quietly in rooms where diversity consultants and activists explained the subtle ways bias seeped into every corner of life. She listened. For the first time in years, she did more listening than speaking. And slowly, she began to realize that her career might yet serve a purpose if she chose to change. Derek Lawson disappeared from headlines quickly, but his own shame lingered. Friends ribbed him about being that guy on the flight, the one caught sneering in the viral video, the one silenced by a calm voice saying that silence teaches the wrong lesson. At first he laughed it off, but at night, alone, he replayed the moment in his mind, hearing his own words echo with hollow arrogance. For the first time in his life, he asked himself whether the seat he occupied had been earned by merit or assumed by entitlement. For Jade Nguyen, life transformed overnight. The sociology student who had pressed record out of instinct became a voice for her generation. News networks sought her commentary. Professors invited her to panels, and strangers sent her messages thanking her for capturing the truth. At first, she felt overwhelmed, the weight of attention too heavy for her young shoulders. But Xavier reached out privately, offering calm words of guidance. "You witnessed," he told her. "That's not small. The world needs witnesses who refuse to look away." She carried those words with her, shaping her graduate research into a study of digital activism and accountability. And for Xavier himself, life did not return to normal. It reshaped itself into something larger. The Redwood Coal Foundation launched with his oversight, its board filled with educators and community leaders he trusted. He visited schools, speaking quietly to young students about possibility. In every classroom he entered, children stared at him not with suspicion, but with awe, whispering to one another, "That's the man from the video?" Yet fame was never his goal. He remained the same calm figure, preferring quiet offices to stages, his words deliberate, his presence steady. When journalists pressed him about whether he had planned the confrontation, he shook his head. "No one plans to be doubted for existing. I only planned not to yield." At home, his daughter watched him closely. The first night after the flight, she climbed into his lap, her eyes wide. "They looked at you like you didn't belong," she whispered, but then they had to say sorry. Xavier held her tightly, his heart swelling. "That's right," he said softly, "and maybe next time, someone else won't have to go through it." That's why we stood our ground. The industry watched too. Other airlines, fearful of being the next headline, scrambled to review their own procedures. Policy papers circulated in Washington, regulators citing Flight 372 as evidence that corporate accountability could no longer be optional. Some called it the Seat 2A standard, the expectation that no passenger should ever be forced to prove their dignity twice. In time, the roar of immediate outrage softened, but the story did not fade. It became part of the larger conversation about race, power, and accountability in America. Xavier's words, "Dignity does not wait for permission," appeared on protest signs, in essays, even printed on T-shirts worn by students on campuses across the country. For the passengers of that flight, the memory remained vivid. Tiana Brooks often told friends about the night she witnessed justice unfold 30,000 feet below where they should have been flying. Her toddler would grow up hearing the story. Too young to remember, but raised with the knowledge that his mother had seen dignity defended in real time. And for Xavier, though he carried himself with the same quiet grace, there was a subtle change. When he walked through airports now, strangers recognized him, offering nods, handshakes, words of thanks. Some whispered their own stories, moments of humiliation, suspicion, doubt. He listened, always listening, reminding them with calm eyes that their stories mattered. One evening, months later, as he boarded another flight, a gate agent glanced at his boarding pass, then at him, and smiled warmly. "Seat 2A, Dr. Cole? Enjoy your flight." For the first time in a long time, Xavier felt something unfamiliar in the air ease. It was fragile, perhaps fleeting, but it was real. Change, he knew, was never complete. But tonight, in this small moment, it was visible, and that was enough to keep going. The world has a way of turning moments into symbols. Months after Flight 372, the number 2A no longer referred only to a seat assignment. It became a phrase whispered in boardrooms, printed in op-eds, etched into the cultural vocabulary. Seat 2A meant resistance without rage, power without spectacle, dignity defended with calm certainty. It meant that silence, when broken by truth, could change more than one life. It could redirect an entire institution. For Xavier Cole, life was both familiar and utterly transformed. He still woke early, still brewed his coffee the same way, still walked his daughter to the bus stop when he was home. He still sat quietly in meetings, listening more than speaking, letting his steady presence guide the rhythm of the room. Yet everywhere he went, echoes of that flight followed him. Strangers stopped him in airports to thank him. Students wrote letters describing how his stance gave them courage. Journalists asked him to explain again how he had remained so composed, as if dignity were a secret formula he could hand out like a recipe. But Xavier knew it wasn't a formula. It was a choice made over and over, across years of small humiliations and invisible barriers, a choice that had crystallized, finally, in the cramped space of an airplane cabin where he had been asked one time too many to prove he belonged. He had chosen not to yield. That was all. And somehow, that had been enough. The Redwood Coal Foundation flourished. Applications poured in from young dreamers across the country, students who wanted to become pilots, engineers, programmers, designers. At its first scholarship ceremony, Xavier stood quietly at the back of the room, watching teenagers in pressed suits and bright dresses walk across the stage to receive their awards. Each one represented not just talent, but possibility. Each one carrying with them the weight of a future that had been widened because of what happened in Seat 2A. When he was invited to speak, he kept his remarks brief. "This is not about me," he said simply. "This is about every door that should have been open, but wasn't. You are the ones who will walk through and keep it open for the next person. That is how change endures." The audience applauded, some wiping tears from their eyes, but Xavier's own daughter sat in the front row, her eyes shining. She understood now in a way she hadn't before. Her father hadn't just told her about dignity. He had shown her. And the world had listened. Back at Redwood Air, reforms were not perfect, but they were real. Training programs reshaped the way staff approached passengers. Supervisors were instructed to treat suspicion not as an excuse, but as a red flag requiring justification. Complaint systems became transparent, every incident logged and monitored by independent oversight. The company invested millions in rebuilding trust, not just because Xavier had demanded it, but because the public demanded it too. Martha Green found herself unexpectedly at the center of those reforms. Though she had once stood as the enforcer of protocol, she now helped design the very systems that dismantled it. In long sessions with consultants and community leaders, she listened, took notes, asked questions she never would have thought to ask before. Slowly, the hard lines of her authority softened into something else, humility. She told her colleagues more than once, "I learned the hard way, and I don't want anyone else to." Paula Whitman, however, drifted into obscurity. She avoided cameras, avoided conversations, avoided the world that knew her face from a viral video. She found work outside the industry, but she carried with her a heaviness she could not shake. Sometimes she replayed Xavier's words in her mind. If your process forces you to humiliate someone who has already complied, then it's not a protocol. It's an excuse. It haunted her. Whether it would eventually change her or crush her, she didn't yet know. Derek Lawson rarely spoke of the flight at all, but late at night, when he scrolled past articles about Seat 2A, when he saw Xavier's calm face in the headlines, he felt a flicker of something he had never known before: shame. It was uncomfortable, but it was also instructive. He began, in small ways, to question himself. Sometimes change begins not with applause, but with silence and reflection. Jade Nguyen thrived. Her footage became part of documentaries, her name attached to panels on digital activism. Professors cited her in academic papers, calling her live stream an example of 21st century witnessing, but she never claimed the spotlight for herself. When asked what mattered most, she always returned to the same point: I didn't create the moment. I just refused to look away. And so the legacy of Flight 372 grew, carried by voices across the country, remembered not for chaos, but for calm, not for shouting, but for silence that refused to be broken. One evening, nearly a year after the flight, Xavier boarded another Redwood airplane. This time, no one questioned his pass. The gate agent smiled warmly, greeting him by name. Passengers in first class glanced at him, some recognizing him immediately, others whispering softly, "That's him." He took his seat 2A again, by coincidence, and settled into the cushion with the quiet ease of a man who knew his place could no longer be disputed. As the plane taxied toward the runway, he looked out the window at the lights shimmering across the tarmac. His reflection stared back at him, layered over the night sky. He thought of his daughter, of the scholarship recipients, of the young voices rising. He thought of the night when silence had broken into consequence. The engines roared, lifting the aircraft into the dark sky. Xavier leaned back, closing his eyes. He knew the fight was never truly finished. But tonight, at 30,000 feet, he allowed himself to feel the peace of knowing that the legacy of Seat 2A was no longer his alone. It belonged to everyone who believed that dignity does not wait for permission. And somewhere, in the hum of the engines, in the rhythm of ascent, the story of that night continued to rise with him, carried into the sky, carried into history. As the engines faded and the story of Seat 2A echoed across the world, one truth became undeniable. Dignity is not a privilege, it is a right. Xavier Cole's calm defiance was more than a personal victory. It was a mirror held up to a system that too often asks the wrong people to prove themselves twice. We watched as an apology was spoken, as reforms were promised, and as a foundation was built to open doors for the next generation. But behind every headline, behind every policy change, there is still the heartache of the moment that began it all, a man humiliated for simply existing in a place he had earned. Let this story remind us that silence can protect prejudice, but courage steady, unflinching courage can break it apart. And let it challenge each of us when dignity is questioned. Will we stand by quietly, or will we stand up, even if standing up means never leaving our seat? The fight against discrimination is far from over, but stories like this prove that one voice, one action can ripple into change felt everywhere. If this story moved you, share it. If it made you reflect, subscribe for more. And if it made you believe in dignity, hit like and join us for the next journey. Together, we rise.